If someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd ever cross a line like this, I would have laughed. Not me. Never. I thought I was better than that. But I didn't understand what loneliness could really do to a person. I didn't understand what it felt like to go years without being truly seen. And the night I saw him like that, it broke something in me. And what I did after, I still don't know how to live with it. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't chasing trouble. I was just trying to survive another quiet evening in a house where love had stopped speaking to me. The lights were off. The rooms were still. The only sound was the hum of the fridge and the weight of silence pressing down on my chest. He was supposed to be asleep. But there was light under his door. And something told me to check. I wish I hadn't. I wish I had just walked past and gone to bed. But I didn't. I pushed the door open just a little. And there he was, sitting on the floor, his back hunched, shoulders shaking, crying. He didn't hear me. He didn't even look up. He just sat there, holding a photo like it was the last piece of something he couldn't get back. He looked so lost. And in that moment, something inside me cracked. I knew that pain. I'd been carrying it in silence for years. I stepped inside, sat down beside him. He didn't move away. He just whispered, "I don't know how to talk to anyone anymore." And I said, "Me neither." There was nothing romantic. Nothing wrong. Not then. Just two people hurting. Two people the world had forgotten how to love. But after that night, things started to change. Little glances. Little moments. I caught myself thinking about him when I shouldn't have. I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. And neither of us said anything. That's how it started. Not with a kiss. Not with a touch. With silence. With eyes. With loneliness. And by the time I realized what was happening, I was already too far in. Before I tell you the rest, please subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever made a mistake you can't explain, you'll understand why I had to tell this story. I was 39. Married. On paper, everything looked fine. Stable, even. We had the house. The 2-car garage. The carefully trimmed hedges. But inside that house, I was disappearing. And no one seemed to notice. My husband, David, he's the kind of man people respect. Hardworking. Reliable. Always on the move. He provides. He fixes things. He pays the bills on time. But he hasn't looked me in the eye, really looked at me, in years. We used to be close. We used to laugh over burnt pancakes on Sundays, dance in the living room when our favorite songs came on. But that faded. It didn't disappear overnight, it was slower than that. Little things. Missed dinners. Quiet "I love yous" said more out of habit than meaning. Eventually, we just stopped trying. He still kisses me on the forehead every morning before leaving for work. Still says goodnight. But there's nothing in between. No warmth. No spark. We share a bed, but not a life. Most days, I'd go through the motions. Wake up. Clean. Answer emails. Cook. I used to write. I used to feel things. Now, I just float. Then Jake came back. My stepson. David's son from his first marriage. He was supposed to be away at college, chasing some dream in another state. But life had other plans. Things didn't work out, and he asked to move back in, just for a while. I remember the day he arrived, 2 suitcases, headphones around his neck, eyes tired, but still holding something I couldn't name. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was taller. His jawline sharper. His voice deeper than I remembered. But it wasn't just how he looked. It was how he carried himself. Quiet. Thoughtful. Watching everything. Like he'd seen more than he ever let on. At first, we hardly spoke. He kept to himself. Late nights in his room. Earbuds in. A stack of books by his bed. But over time, things shifted. One evening, I was in the kitchen alone. The dishes were done. The house was still. I poured a glass of wine I knew I wouldn't finish. And before I could stop it, the tears came. Soft at first, then harder. I didn't even try to hide it. I thought no one was around. But when I turned, he was there. Jake. He stood in the doorway. No judgment in his eyes. Just concern. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't say anything at all. And somehow, that made it worse. Because in that moment, he saw me. Not the woman who kept his father's house running. Not the polite stepmother he tolerated. Me. Just me. I wiped my face quickly, muttered something about allergies. He nodded slowly, like he knew it was a lie but didn't want to make it harder for me. Our eyes met for just a second too long. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't inappropriate. But something unspoken passed between us. A crack in the wall neither of us realized we'd been leaning against. From that night on, something was different. I started noticing little things. How he always waited until I was done in the kitchen before grabbing his food. How he offered to help carry groceries when David didn't even look up from his phone. How he asked how my day was and actually waited for the answer. I didn't know what to make of it, but I started looking forward to those brief moments of connection. A question, a smile, a shared silence that felt more comforting than 1,000 empty words from my husband. And maybe he noticed things too. Like how I lingered in the living room after everyone went to bed. How I played the same song on repeat some nights just to feel something. How I always looked tired, even when I'd slept 8 hours. There was a night, early spring. I was folding laundry in the guest room. He passed by the door, then stopped and came back. "Need help?" he asked. I laughed. "With laundry?" He shrugged. "It's just folding." He sat beside me, and we folded in silence. It was innocent, but something about it felt intimate. Not physical, just close. After he left, I sat on the bed and stared at the spot where he'd been. I felt warm. Not in a romantic way. Not yet. But in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Like I mattered. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had begun. Quiet. Slow. Almost invisible. But it was there. And I didn't know if I should be terrified. Or relieved. It was late. Maybe just after midnight. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses into your ears and makes your own breath sound too loud. David was asleep, snoring faintly beside me, his back turned, like always. I couldn't sleep. Again. So I got up, wrapped my robe tighter around me, and padded down the hallway. I wasn't going anywhere in particular, just walking. Sometimes I do that when my thoughts won't stop spinning. As I passed Jake's room, I heard it. Soft at first, almost like the wind. Then I realized it wasn't the wind. It was crying, muffled, broken, the kind that comes from deep in the chest. The kind that only escapes when no one's supposed to hear. I froze. My hand hovered near the door, unsure. Was it my place? Should I knock? Should I leave him alone? I waited, listened again. And that sound, it wasn't just crying. It was grief. I slowly turned the doorknob and eased the door open, just a crack. He didn't notice me. He was on the floor, back against the bed, legs pulled close to his chest. His head was bowed, hair falling over his face, shoulders trembling. There were photos scattered around him, old ones. I recognized some of them. Pictures of him as a child. Smiling, sitting on his mother's lap. Her handwriting was on one of the corners. In his hand was a folded letter. Worn at the edges. Read too many times. He clutched it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. I didn't mean to intrude. I whispered his name, gently. Jake. His head lifted slowly, eyes red, face pale. He didn't try to hide it. Didn't look away or wipe his tears. He just stared at me like a child who'd been trying so hard to be strong and finally couldn't anymore. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. I stepped inside, kneeling down beside him. "You don't have to be." He looked down at the letter again, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it and placed it in his lap. "She wrote this when I turned 16, he murmured. Said she knew I'd need it one day. I guess. I didn't think the day would come so soon." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? So I did the only thing that felt right in that moment. I reached out and pulled him into a hug. At first, he didn't move. Then his arms slowly wrapped around me, and his body leaned in heavy, desperate, worn. It wasn't planned. It wasn't careful. It was instinct. Just a hug, but it lingered. A few seconds too long. Just long enough for something to shift in the air between us. He didn't cry anymore. He just held on. Like he'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to make him feel safe again. And then, just above a whisper, he said, "Thank you for seeing me." And I felt my heart pull in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not the way you feel when someone compliments your dress. Not the way you feel when someone holds the door open. This was something deeper. Something dangerous. I pulled back slowly. His eyes met mine, clearer now, but still heavy with pain. I wanted to say something comforting. Something wise. But nothing came out. So I stood up, quietly, and left the room. Closed the door behind me. Leaning against the wall just outside, hand over my chest, feeling it beat faster than it had in a long, long time. And in that moment, something inside me stirred. Something I had buried. Something I thought was gone. And that was the beginning of everything. After that night, I told myself it was nothing. A moment of comfort, that's all. A hug between two people who were hurting in different ways. I told myself that over and over, until I didn't believe it anymore. Because the truth is, it did mean something. Not in the way it should have. Not in the way I could explain. But it cracked open something I'd tried so hard to keep buried. The way his arms wrapped around me, the way he held on like I mattered, God, I hadn't felt that in so long. Not from David. Not from anyone. At first, I felt ashamed. Disgusted with myself. How could I feel anything other than maternal concern? He's a child. Not literally, but close enough. He's my husband's son. My stepson. But every time I told myself to forget it, my heart whispered something else. It reminded me how warm it felt. How alive I felt. How seen I felt. I tried to push it down. Tried to go back to normal. But normal felt colder than ever. David came home late the next day. Didn't ask how I was. Didn't notice the dinner I made or the fact that I'd cried in the bathroom before setting the table. He sat in front of the TV, played on his lap, eyes locked on the news. I said something about needing a hug. He nodded absently. Later, he said. Later never came. I remember lying in bed that night, his back to me again. The room so silent I could hear my own heartbeat. I turned toward him anyway, stared at the back of his neck, wondering if he even remembered the shape of my voice. Wondering if he noticed that I no longer reached for him. I closed my eyes and saw Jake's face instead. I felt sick. I felt safe. And I hated myself for both. The next few days, I avoided Jake. Kept conversations short, stayed busy, made excuses. But he didn't push. He just smiled softly when we passed in the hall. Like he knew, but wouldn't say anything. Then one night, he left a book on the kitchen counter. No note. No explanation. Just something we had talked about a week earlier. A novel I mentioned loving years ago. I found myself reading it again slowly. And when he asked what I thought of the ending, I answered. And the conversation unfolded like we were equals. We talked about books, music, the things that made us feel alive. We started having tea together in the evenings. Nothing planned. Just quiet. Familiar. Easy. Sometimes we sat in silence. Sometimes we laughed. It became a routine. One I pretended didn't matter. But when he wasn't there, I noticed. I noticed too much. I started looking at the clock, wondering when he'd come home. I'd glance at the front door when I heard footsteps. I'd adjust my hair before going downstairs. Change into something just a little nicer, even if it was just a sweater that fit a little better, jeans that hugged a little more. I told myself I was just tired of looking invisible. But that wasn't the whole truth. And then the dream started. I had one where he touched my face. So gently. Like I was fragile, like I mattered. I woke up breathless. Guilt flooding every inch of me. I sat in the dark, hand over my mouth, whispering, "What is wrong with you?" But the next night, I dreamt again. Only this time, I didn't want to wake up. I kept trying to tell myself this wasn't real. That this was just loneliness talking. That I was being selfish, dramatic, delusional. I'm the adult. He's hurting. I'm helping. This is care, isn't it? I needed it to be. Because if it wasn't, then what kind of person did that make me? Still, I kept holding on to the boundary. Or at least, I tried. But that boundary blurred more every day. And then, one evening, I walked into the living room. Jake was sitting on the couch, reading, headphones around his neck, lamp casting a warm glow behind him. I didn't say anything. I was just passing through. But something made me stop. I turned back for a second. Just to look. And he was looking at me. Not with surprise. Not like he was caught. But like he'd been watching, quietly, openly. Our eyes locked. And in that stillness, the air shifted again. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. And neither did I. It was just past 11 when I wandered into the kitchen one night. I hadn't eaten dinner. David had worked late again. I'd left his plate on the table, untouched, cold. Another night of silence, another meal eaten alone. I thought everyone had gone to bed, but as I stepped in, the light was on. And there was Jake. Back to me, standing at the stove, stirring something gently, barefoot, hair messy from a long day. The smell hit me first, garlic, herbs, something comforting. I paused in the doorway, unsure if I should say anything. He turned around before I could decide. Couldn't sleep? He asked. I nodded. You. He gave a soft shrug. Thought I'd cook. It helps. He gestured to the 2 plates on the counter. I made extra. I didn't know what to say. So I sat down. We ate together in quiet at first. Then the conversation started, naturally, slowly. He told me about his mother. Not the surface stories, the real ones. How she struggled. How the world didn't understand her pain. How he used to sit outside her door, listening to her cry. Afraid to knock. Afraid not to. And when she died, he said it felt like the one person who ever understood him had been ripped out of the world. I think she would have liked you, he said softly, eyes locked on his plate. You remind me of her in some ways, except she never smiled the way you do when you're listening. I didn't know what to do with that. So I smiled again, the way he said I did. Then it happened. I had a crumb at the corner of my mouth I didn't even notice. But he did. He reached across the table, slowly, and brushed it away with his thumb. His fingers lingered. Just for a second. And in that second, everything stopped. My breath caught. His hand didn't move. Our eyes met. The silence was deafening. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. Then, just as gently, he pulled his hand back. Said nothing. And I didn't stop him. That night became the first of many. We started spending time together. Not by plan, but by pattern. Late night tea. Movies on the couch, lights dimmed. Books shared and exchanged like little pieces of ourselves. The air between us shifted. Thicker. Heavier. Charged. I started noticing the way he watched me when I spoke. Not like someone listening out of politeness. But like every word I said meant something. And I felt beautiful. Not in a vain, superficial way. But in that way where someone actually sees you. Not the way you look. But the way you are. David didn't ask questions. Didn't notice how often Jake and I were in the same room. Didn't notice me at all. One night, Jake and I were watching an old film, something romantic and slow and heavy with emotion. There was a moment on screen where the couple kissed for the first time. I looked away. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I felt seen in that moment, and I didn't want him to see my face. But I could feel his eyes on me. He didn't say anything until the movie ended. Then, in the soft quiet of the credits, he turned to me and said, "You're the only one who treats me like I matter." I should have shut it down right then. I should have created space, drawn a line, backed away. But instead, I stayed quiet. Because part of me needed to hear that. Needed it more than I ever admitted to myself. I wanted to matter too. I told myself it wasn't wrong. We hadn't done anything. We were just talking, laughing, connecting. But deep down, I knew. I felt the guilt gnawing away in the quiet moments. When I passed David in the hallway. When I caught my own reflection while brushing my hair, eyes too wide, too aware. I started losing sleep, dreaming of Jake. Not always physical, sometimes just emotional. Him sitting on my bed, brushing the hair from my face, telling me I wasn't invisible. Every time I walked away, I swore I'd put distance between us. But every time, something pulled me back. The way he looked at me when I laughed. The way he paused before saying my name. The way he lingered in doorways, like he didn't want to leave the room. It wasn't physical yet, but it felt bigger than that. It felt like the foundation of my life was cracking, slowly, silently. And still, I kept standing in the middle of it. Until one night, I walked into the living room, and what I saw changed everything. I wasn't looking for him that night. It was late, later than usual. The house was quiet, and something about the air felt heavy. Still, David had fallen asleep hours earlier, TV buzzing faintly in the background of our bedroom, his back turned to me, as always. I couldn't stay there. I felt like I was suffocating. So I got up, barefoot, walked slowly down the stairs, the wood cool under my feet. The living room lights were off, but there was a soft glow flickering from the lamp by the bookshelf. And music, faint, almost imperceptible at first, but I could hear it. The beat, the rhythm, the melancholy pulse of something slow and aching. I turned the corner, and there he was. Jake, alone in the living room, eyes closed, headphones on, moving gently to music only he could hear. He wasn't dancing the way young men dance. Not wild, not loud. He moved like the music was inside him, like it was pulling him apart, piece by piece. I stopped. I didn't mean to watch, but I couldn't look away. There was something about the way he moved. So open, so vulnerable. Like he'd finally let go of all the masks he wore during the day. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. His fingers flexed and curled with every slow step. He turned slowly, lost in the rhythm. And then, he saw me. I froze. He pulled the headphones down, just enough to hear. Didn't say anything. Didn't look away. And neither did I. There was a pause. The kind of pause that hangs heavy in the air, like the world is waiting to exhale. Then, I stepped forward. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to say something. Maybe I just wanted to be near whatever he was feeling. We stood there, not quite facing each other, but close enough. He extended his hand. No words. I hesitated. Then I placed mine in his. He guided me gently, slowly, into his rhythm. No music for me. Just the thud of my heartbeat, pounding in my ears. The silence between us growing louder with every second. We swayed, bare feet on carpet. His hand on my waist, my palm against his chest. I could feel everything. The rise and fall of his breath. The way his fingers trembled slightly, unsure. The way he looked at me like I was more than a person, like I was a memory he didn't want to forget. Our eyes locked. His hand slid down, fingers brushing against mine. He paused. And then, he leaned in. So slowly, so deliberately, like he was giving me every chance to stop him. I didn't. His lips touched mine. Soft, just for a moment. But in that moment, the ground shifted. The walls I'd built around myself crumbled in an instant. I felt it. All of it. Longing, warmth, panic, regret. I pulled back. Quickly. Too quickly. My breath caught in my throat. He stared at me, eyes wide, heart in his mouth. I thought, you wanted this too, he whispered. I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore. I stumbled back, turned on my heel and ran. Up the stairs. Past the dark hallway. Into the bathroom. I locked the door behind me. I leaned over the sink, both hands gripping the porcelain like it was the only thing holding me up. My face was flushed. My lips still tingled. My chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow gasps. I looked up, into the mirror, and what I saw was a stranger. A woman with wild eyes and shaking hands. A woman who had just crossed a line she swore she never would. My gaze dropped. And that's when I saw it. My wedding ring. Lying on the counter. I hadn't even realized I took it off. I don't remember doing it. But there it was. Small. Shiny. Meaningless. I stared at it. At what it was supposed to represent. At what it no longer did. And for the first time in years, I didn't cry. I just stood there. Completely and utterly undone. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The house was still. David was asleep beside me, snoring softly, his hand resting on the pillow between us, an unconscious barrier neither of us dared to cross anymore. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, trying to pretend my life hadn't shifted beneath me. But everything had changed. I could still feel Jake's breath, the warmth of it, the look in his eyes. That kiss, brief, soft, forbidden, burned like a scar I couldn't cover. And I knew. I knew we'd gone too far. Even if it had only been a second. Even if we hadn't said the words. We'd stepped across a line we couldn't erase. For the next few days, there was silence. Not the ordinary kind we'd all gotten used to, but something colder. Thicker. Heavier. Like the walls of the house were holding their breath. Jake stayed in his room mostly. He didn't come down for tea. Didn't ask about books or movies or music. He didn't look at me when we crossed paths, just kept his head down, earbuds in, eyes glazed over like I didn't exist. It was like we were pretending nothing happened. Except I couldn't pretend. Not really. Not when every room in that house felt like it was haunted by that one moment. David noticed the change in me barely. He made a passing comment one night at dinner. "You seem a little off. Work stress?" I nodded. Smiled. Lied. "Yeah. Just a lot going on." He didn't press. He never did. And that somehow made it worse. Because part of me wanted to be caught. Wanted someone to look at me and see the guilt written all over my face. Wanted someone to say, "What's going on with you?" and actually mean it. But no one did. So I carried it alone. I tried to busy myself. Cleaned out the pantry, reorganized the linen closet, baked things I didn't even want to eat. I smiled through conversations. Laughed at the right moments. Pretended to be normal. But the weight of that kiss, it followed me everywhere. And then came the moment that broke me. I was coming back from the grocery store. Parked in the driveway. About to step out. That's when I saw him. Jake. In his car, just a few feet away. He didn't see me. His head was resting against the steering wheel. His shoulders shaking. He was crying. Not like before. This was different. This was the kind of cry that comes when everything inside you finally gives out. I sat there, frozen, hand still on the door handle, torn between reaching out and staying away. My thumb hovered over his name in my phone. I typed, "Are you okay?" Paused. Backspaced. Typed again. "Do you want to talk?" Then I stared at the screen. My heart screaming send it. But I didn't. I deleted it. Turned off the phone. And sat in the silence of my car, hating myself for every reason I didn't press send. That night, I found a note on the kitchen table. His handwriting. Short. Simple. "I'm sorry. I'll move out soon." I stared at the words until they blurred. It felt like a punch to the gut. Not because I didn't expect it, but because it made everything real. He was leaving. And with him, the only part of me that had felt alive in years. That should have been a relief. A clean break. An exit from the danger zone. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like grief. The kind of grief that comes not from death, but from knowing you ruined something that could never be undone. I sat at the kitchen table for hours that night, lights off, the note in my hand, a glass of untouched wine beside me. And somewhere between the ticking of the clock and the ache in my chest, I made the most terrifying decision of all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark for hours, the silence pressing in around me, the weight of Jake's note heavy in my hands. "I'm sorry. I'll move out soon." 10 words. That's all it took to pull the rug out from under me. I read it over and over, like the meaning might change the 10th time through. But it didn't. He was leaving. And I didn't know who I was without that connection. At some point, my face was wet with tears. I don't even remember when I started crying. They weren't loud sobs. Just slow, steady streams. tears that had been waiting far too long to fall. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel it. The loneliness. All of it. The kind that doesn't come from being alone in a room, but from being invisible in a life you helped build. From smiling when no one's watching. From whispering your needs into a void that never answers back. I had spent so many years pretending I was okay, convincing myself that stability was enough. That comfort was love. That silence was peace. But Jake, he tore that illusion apart. And I kept asking myself, was it ever really about him? Or was it just the first time in years someone truly saw me? Someone who looked at me like I mattered. Like I wasn't just the woman who kept the house running and the fridge full. Someone who listened when I spoke. Who noticed when my eyes dimmed and my shoulders sagged. Was it love? No, not real love. But it was something. And whatever it was, I craved it. And I crossed a line to feel it. Even if nothing more happened. Even if it stopped with one kiss. I crossed a line. And I can't take that back. I stepped into a world I never should have entered. I touched fire and told myself I wouldn't get burned. But here I am, ash and ruin and guilt I can't wash away. I tried to write to him. I sat at the desk in the guest room, pen shaking in my hand, heart in my throat. The letter wasn't long. Jake, I'm sorry. Not just for what happened, but for what I allowed. You're not to blame. You needed comfort, and I blurred the lines. I don't know what this was. Maybe I'll never understand it. But I hope you find peace. Real peace. I hope you find someone who can love you the right way. I'm not that person. And I never should have let you believe I could be. I folded it, put it in an envelope. But I never gave it to him. I tucked it into the back of a drawer. Because some words, they're better left unsent. I told myself it was time to try again with David. To fix what was broken. To be honest. To be whole. We went out to dinner, first time in months. I wore the dress he used to love. He didn't say a word about it. We talked about bills. Weather. Work. I looked across the table at this man I'd shared a life with. And I felt nothing. Not anger. Not resentment. Just emptiness. Like we were strangers wearing old wedding rings, waiting for the check. I reached for his hand out of habit. He smiled politely, squeezed once, and let go. And in that moment, I realized something awful. It wasn't that I didn't love him anymore. It was that I couldn't even remember what that love had felt like. I'd gone too far. Not just with Jake, but with myself. I'd lost who I was somewhere between dinner plans and unanswered questions and cold bedsheets. And now, I didn't know how to find her again. Sometimes, late at night, I ask myself the question I know others would ask if they knew. Did anything else happen between you and Jake? And the truth is, I don't know how to answer that. Because a kiss can mean more than a touch. A look can say more than a word. And sometimes, a connection runs so deep, you don't need to cross every line to feel like you've betrayed everything. All I know is that something passed between us. Something fragile and reckless and human. Something I wasn't ready for. Something I never should have allowed. And now, I live with that. Every single day. I never imagined it would come to this. I still don't know how to forgive myself. Or if I even should. What happened between Jake and me wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of years of silence. Of being untouched. Unnoticed. Unheard. I didn't set out to cross a line. But sometimes, the lines blur so slowly, you don't even realize you've stepped over them until you're standing in the wreckage. I keep replaying it in my head. The late nights. The lingering stares. The sound of my own breath when everything else in the house had gone quiet. Was it him I wanted? Or was it anyone who could look at me and say, I see you? Have you ever felt that way? Craving connection in the wrong place? Yearning for something so badly that you convince yourself it's okay? Just for a little while? What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have walked away? Would you have confessed everything? Or would you have, like me, carried it in silence? I'd really like to know. So please, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me the truth, whatever that means for you. Let's not pretend these things are black and white. Because they aren't. And if this story stirred something in you, something real, something raw. Please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss more stories just like this, right here on Shocking Infidelity Saga. Your voice matters here. Because in this space, we speak the truths no one else wants to say out loud. Sometimes, love isn't what you're looking for. It's what you're missing. The hand that doesn't reach for you in the night. The conversation that never comes. The kiss that hasn't happened in years. But when that emptiness grows louder than your conscience, things break. This isn't a story about lust. It's not about scandal or scandalous intentions. It's about being seen, being heard, and how dangerous it can be. When you've felt invisible for too long, we all want to feel alive. We all want to matter. But some places, some people, aren't meant to be the source of that comfort. Because sometimes, comfort costs everything.